My topic today really is, are we ready for the next emergent disease? What I'd like to say is that in terms of the industry, we have what are really unprecedented risks in terms of infectious diseases, but we also have unprecedented opportunities. And I'm hoping to lay out both scenarios for you, both sides of that equation in this talk. What I would like to point out is that there's no new ideas in this talk. I am responsible for the content, but I can't actually lay claim to any of these ideas. And so hopefully this will be, if you're a science person, this probably isn't a great talk for you, but if you like to look at stories, this could be an interesting story. So I recently heard a very prominent practitioner say that FAD, particularly FMD, had never been in the U.S. before, and it occurred to me that we probably need a brief review of what's happened in terms of FADs in the U.S. And so we'll start there. We've actually had, in red I just have the pathogens of most interest to swine. And here you have, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 outbreaks of FMD since about 1870 in the U.S. These costs, I've already gone ahead, but these costs here come from a publication in 1975. You could probably put at least 1 0 and maybe even 2 zeros around most of those cost estimates. So just to review quickly, here's 3 outbreaks of foot and mouth in the U.S., 1870, 1880, 1884, and you can see all on the East Coast. They all came from imported European livestock. And so that's the point in time when FMD was rampant in Europe, and that's actually when the Western Hemisphere got seeded, both North America and South America, with FMD. Interestingly enough, there was very little spread. All 3 of these outbreaks were very quickly eliminated, and the consequence was that we passed laws banning import of livestock, meat, or animal byproducts from countries with endemic FMD. The next outbreak was 1902. Here again on the East Coast, this actually came from imported Vaccinia virus contaminated with FMD. And in this case, it spread much more widely, and we ended up, when we say 244 herds, 5,000 animals, we mean stamping out. So these animals were euthanized and buried. What is this association with Vaccinia virus contaminated with FMD? And this is the time when we were growing, we were producing smallpox vaccine on animals. And so here's Vaccinia virus was grown on the skin of calves, and then the lesions harvested before they crusted over. So that's your smallpox vaccine way back when. This again happened in 1908. In this case, it was a bigger outbreak, and we finally figured out that, hey, you better test these Vaccinia inocula for FMD before you use them. The reason this stuff got moved around is these calves wasn't recognized they actually had FMD, and so they go into the marketplace and they'd move, and there you get transmission. Here in 1914, contaminated hog cholera serum from animals showing no signs of slaughter. 1914. So in this case, in 1903, Marion Dorset from USDA demonstrated that classical swine fever was caused by a virus or a filtrable agent. By 1907, they had developed simultaneous inoculation with virus and antiserum, and it worked pretty well. In 1908, they started training other manufacturers in this process. Some of the more clever individuals among us figured out that they could actually just go to slaughter, collect, rather than inoculating animals under research conditions, they just went and collected serum from animals at slaughter, which of course had lots of different things, including, in some case, FMD. So in this case, 11 weeks from the index case to the quarantine, we had extensive movement of animals and byproducts, and we had FMD in 22 states and the District of Columbia. One of the themes in this talk is this time to detection. The second major theme in this talk is movement of animals and byproducts. So this is our first case report. In this case, then, we had over 3,500 herds that were affected, 77,000 cattle, 10,000 sheep, 85,000 hogs, 100 goats, and 9 deer were eliminated. 1924, we had 2 outbreaks, one in California and one in Texas. In the California case, garbage feeding operations were still very common. And so garbage from the Navy Yard was fed to animals in California, ended up in a break. And here we had almost 1,000 herd of cattle, swine, and sheep, 131,000 animals. And this is the only time foot and mouth got into wildlife in the U.S. And it resulted in, it took 2 years for them to kill 22,000 mule deer here in this national forest. That will never happen again. If it gets in wildlife again, forget it. Even at this time, there were massive protests against the slaughter of deer. In Texas, we had much more rapid detection and rapid elimination, 30 days. You still had 1,400 herds affected, 20,000 cattle, 1,000 pigs, 1,000 sheep, a few goats. 1929, garbage from a ship coming from South America. Again, the garbage feeding operations were very common, relatively small outbreak. And then I'm going to mention this outbreak in Mexico because it was significant. 1946, this outbreak was not eradicated until 1954. So we have 8 years of attempts to control. Part of the problem in this case was that people weren't in agreement in 1946 that it was actually foot and mouth. There was debate about whether foot and mouth or something else. And it took 2 months to get confirmation of the presence of FMDV by sending samples to PRRS. 2 months. During that entire 2-month period of time, animals were moving, everything, the industry continued business as usual. A USDA study from 1947 recommended the establishment of facilities in the U.S. to deal with these kind of agents. And it's interesting to read this report. They figured out later, they took the recommendations and built the Plum Island facility. And if you read the literature from that time, they are patting themselves gleefully on the back for their extreme intelligence in building this facility on an island away from livestock. And that's all I'll say about that. Here's 1952. We're going to switch gears. We're going to talk about VESV, another vesicular disease. So VESV was first identified in California in 1932, strongly associated with garbage feeding operations again. For 20 years, VESV continued circulating in California because there were still debates over states' rights versus federal rights. And so the federal authority said, it's your problem, California, you deal with it. And that worked out fine until 1952, when pork being fed to passengers on a train got to Wyoming, and garbage feeding operations in Wyoming took the leftovers, fed to pigs, ended up with VSV. It wasn't detected in Wyoming. It actually, some of these animals were sent to the Grand Labs in Nebraska, and Grand Labs figured out that, in fact, they were looking at VSV. But by that time, it had spread to 43 states. This is just a matter of a few weeks, because part of the thing we're seeing here is transportation is improving. It wasn't eradicated until 1956. Over 100,000 pigs were eliminated. And the most significant consequence here was that we ended up with a ban on feeding uncooked garbage. So this is historical, but in fact some of these issues are still extremely relevant. We've got FMD in 60% of the countries in the world. These yellow indications are places where we've had FMD outbreaks between 1992 through 2002, including this outbreak in the UK that cost around $4 billion USD. So Tim Carpenter has done a lot of the work on this stuff, and I'll cite a number of his publications. Here's one from 2011. His estimated cost of an outbreak of FMD in the U.S. is between 2.3 and roughly $70 billion. You can do a lot of surveillance. You can do a lot of preemptive surveillance when you're looking at those kind of losses. This cost figure is so wide because it turns out the models depend a whole lot on where it goes in and how it's distributed and how quickly, particularly how quickly it's detected. So we have people thinking about these things. Here's a list of bad guys, and they're ranked by an expert committee at American Association of Swine Veterinarians and by the National Pork Board. And you can see the lists aren't complete. The ranking is not completely in agreement, but you can see the FMD, African swine fever, Glasgow swine fever, the historical bad guys still show up toward the top of the list. So at least we're thinking about these things. So you see there's differences in these outbreaks. Sometimes they're quickly eliminated, sometimes they're not. So what are the important variables that drive elimination? There's actually a long list, but I think the most important ones to think about here are herd size, which by that I mean structure of the industry, transportation, and that means movement of animals, byproducts and biologics, and then time to detection. This one is huge. Time to detection is huge. So just look quickly at the structure of the U.S. industry, and I apologize. I know this is a very U.S.-centric talk, but it's easy to get these data, and I think the lessons apply from wherever you are living in the world. So it turns out that in the U.S., by the latter half of the 1700s, the farmers in Pennsylvania figured out that they could grow more corn than they could eat. But then they had to do something with it, and there were no roads, so they could either raise livestock and drive the livestock to market, or they could produce whiskey. And they probably did some of both, but we know for sure they raised pigs. By 1840, Cincinnati was the world's largest pork stockyard. And by 1847 in the U.S., we had 35 million pigs and 20 million people. This is a picture showing someone, a drover, bringing hogs actually to Chicago. I don't know if you saw him on the way in. And this actually is the way we raised animals for much of history. Actually, this guy back here looks a lot like my grandfather. He's not my grandfather, but he could be my grandfather. And this could be a scene from my childhood. So these are important numbers. Essentially, from about 1880 to now, in the U.S., we've consistently had roughly 60 million pigs in inventory. That's been consistent the whole time. These numbers are moving from 1900 to 2012. What's really significant here is pigs per farm. And so you can see here in 1900, our average number of pigs per farm was 15, and that was pretty consistent all the way through 1960. In 1980, we start seeing this changing trend, 100 pigs per farm, and that's changed rapidly. Now, most of us know that, in fact, the majority of those animals are held in large systems, and that the majority of these farmers run very small numbers of animals. So we see this increase in the size of herds. For disease ecologists, this is a really significant figure because we know that disease control is quickly complicated as population size grows. Clinical signs become more difficult. Herd immunity is more difficult to establish. So this means big problems the next time we need to control something that's difficult. So herd structure is an important thing. Herd size is very important. The other part is transportation. And so what do we see? In the UK, we've known that the transportation, whether it's animals, whether it's people, things moving around move disease. Armies are a great way to move disease. In the UK, what they saw was construction of the railroads permitting rapid movement of cattle over long distances resulted in a series of rinderpest outbreaks. And so the consequence here was we started having movement restrictions on animals, and intelligently they formed the British State Veterinary Service. Before that, they didn't have any such body. In the U.S., what do we see? The first trip from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast occurred in 1903. It was done by Horatio Nelson Jackson, a physician who did it on a bet. It took him 65 days, and he averaged about 4 miles an hour. And this is a picture of him doing that trip. In 1915, big breakthrough, we had our first transcontinental highway, and I put highway in quotes because it's just a dirt track, a contiguous dirt track that went across the entire coast. It still took you 20 to 30 days. We really saw a huge difference as we start moving from Class B to Class A roads and into pavement. And then finally, here we see the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, Eisenhower administration setting up the Interstate interstate highway system. And what do we know for today? We know that we are moving about 1 million pigs a day. 1 million pigs a day are moving on the roads. And in fact, if you think about it, we actually have a transcontinental continuous flow production system. And we all know how well continuous flow production systems work. But if you look at this, at the entire industry, that's what you have. In shipments, these are in shipments means animals that cross state lines. And we have these numbers here in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2011. What we see here, this total is 4.5 million in 1980. We're up almost 10 times more by the time we get to the year 2011. 10 times more pigs moving across state lines. Phenomenal, phenomenal animal movement. So what do we know about time to detection? Because remember, that's our third part. Structure of the industry, herd size. Transportation, number 2. The third element is time to detection. So here we are, 2001. This is the FMDV outbreak in the UK. Before the first reports of FMD reached the British officials, infected animals, hundreds of them, were crisscrossing the country in hundreds of separate movements, so that the main geographical spread of the disease occurred before any suspicion that the disease was present in the country. If I have a fourth theme, it's syndromic surveillance ain't going to work. Here's people that have experience, they're smart people, and it occurred before, the spread occurred before any suspicion of the disease entered their minds. In France, they were already alerted, and so they quickly identified diseased animals, FMDV diseased animals, and they were able to avoid large-scale outbreaks. France sustained minimal losses and was declared FMD-free within months. This is a GA report from the year 2002, which I'll refer to because it's an interesting report. This time to detection is huge. This is some work again by Tim Carpenter. Estimated daily losses associated with the diagnostic delay in a simulated FMDV outbreak in a California dairy. And here's the bottom line. The effect of delaying the detection of FMD for 1 hour after the expected 21-day detection delay was 2,000 animals, 6 infected premises, and around 500 million. Time to detection is huge. So what do we know of, what's the facts about time to detection? Here's an illustration from African swine fever in Russia between 2009 to 2011, the average of 4.6 days and up to 11 days from the first sign of African swine fever, usually a dead pig, to confirmation. This is a case, classical swine fever in Spain. This is an outbreak 1997 to 1998. So Europe knows they have to live with classical swine fever. They know the risk from feral swine. They should be alert. They should be ready. But here, what do we see? 59 infected farms in Segovia. Average time to detection, 14. That's the mean time. But there's a range of 6 to 39 disease. It's 39 days. Again, a case in Spain, 2001 to 2002, 49 outbreaks in Catalonia. Contributing to the spread of disease, the existence of other swine diseases on some of the affected holdings delayed detection of classical swine fever for up to 60 days, 2 months. Again, these are people that know about classical swine fever. They know what they're looking for. They've seen it before. So here's modeling the effectiveness and risk of vaccination. This is from the Netherlands. This is the detection time distribution curve. And again, this line here is 21 days. The top is finisher farms and piglets. The bottom is sows. You can see that the mean on the finishing sites was over 20 days. Again, an area where they know about classical swine fever. They know they need to be alert. So we were focusing on herd size, transportation, and time to detection. There's nothing we can do here. We cannot change the way the industry is constructed. It's in many ways extremely efficient. Transportation, we are not going to change pig flow. So the only thing we have to work with is time to detection. That's the only thing we can work on. So what do we need to expect for the next time? Because we've seen in the last couple of years that we are not immune, we're not invulnerable. there's cracks and things will get in. So, although FMD endemic countries can predict the spatial and temporal distribution, the same is not true for countries that have been FMD-free for an extended period of time. This, again, is from Tim Carpenter. And so what he's saying, my interpretation, is there's lots of disease models, but in fact, nobody knows what's going to happen when classical swine fever or foot and mouth comes in this country. So we have the predictions, but the predictions aren't really worth anything. The spread is going to depend on the herd type and the location. If this is an introduction into a small herd in nowhere in the flatlands of Texas, it may not go anywhere. But if it ends up in central Iowa, it's going to move fast. So herd type and location, the time to detection, and the control strategy. So what should we expect? In terms of the perspective of a diagnostic lab, you better be ready to test lots of samples and very fast. When the U.S. was engaged in Ojeski's disease eradication, the last 3 years of that program, Iowa State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab had the burden of testing. We were running between 1 and 2 million samples annually. That's 5,000 to 10,000 samples tested and the positives retested every day. That's a lot of tests to run every day. And for whatever FAD shows up tomorrow, we're going to need that level or greater testing capacity the day after. How are we going to do that? I want to take a peek at what we're doing now. We're doing some things right. We're doing some things very well. Premise ID, the ability to locate specifically and quickly where diagnostic lab samples are coming from or where animals are coming from, that's getting better. Premise ID is huge, and it's going to continue to improve. I think right now at Iowa State, about 85% of our cases come in with a premise ID. That's excellent. We do have ongoing surveillance. USDA, of course, is conducting surveillance, and in some cases, a lot of surveillance. So here's market swine and cull salvos and boars, and here we have numbers that you can't see in the back, but it's 240,000 samples were tested in 2013 among cull sows and boars. Almost 180,000 samples for brucellosis. Market swine, here we got 11,000 animals tested. Here's other sources of samples, commingling locations, VDLs, on-farm collections, wildlife monitoring. I don't have most of these numbers, and I should acknowledge that Dr. Troy Bigelow provided this information to me. I took his 60-minute talk and consolidated it into one slide, so there may be some details missing. Here we see at the diagnostic labs relatively few numbers. Here's 20,000 pseudorabies tests. Here's 2,281 pigs tested in 2013 for classical swine fever virus. So there is a little bit of testing going on at the diagnostic labs. My argument is that we need to do much more. I mentioned earlier that I'm not much of a fan of syndromic surveillance. If you go back and look at the history books, the Director General of the British Public Health Service, William Farr, who was in that position for 40 or 50 years in 1800s, had a system of syndromic diagnostics. He had a team of elderly women that would go look at corpses and come up with a diagnosis. And that was the basis on which a lot of his calculations were done, because he was really one of the first analytical epidemiologists. The fact of the matter is, however, that we don't have very many diseases that produce pathognomonic signs, except for measles and maybe smallpox. This is a picture of a person who recovered from smallpox in 1900. Beyond measles and smallpox, we really don't have anything that's that pathognomonic. And so around 1850, Virchow started looking at things at the cellular level, and we began developing diagnostics. So for the last essentially 160 years, we've been developing diagnostics. And we develop them because we need them. We can't look and see things. You need to test. And so here's another case of this delay in diagnostics. When classical swine fever entered, and this is Mexico, it took between 1 week and 2 months before the owner suspected the disease. We can't afford those kind of delays. So what can we do better? I like this slide. Generals always prepared to fight the last war, especially if they won. And you can't find where this is a very famous quote, but if you look, there is no source. It's that old. What I like is here's World War I is over, and this is November 11th, 1918. November 11th, 1918. What do we see? Here, April 1919, and here's World War I, the first great conflict that was mechanized and horrible slaughter at an industrial level. And so here we are in the next April, and there's a call for better horses. We need better horses, not better tanks or airplanes or anything else. So the failure to recognize the issues in the new war. Actually, the U.S. Cavalry was maintained through World War II, and I had a professor in veterinary school who was with the Cavalry Corps, horses and men, the whole thing. They sent his group down to Baja California for the duration of World War II, the entire World War II, waiting, I guess, for something to happen. So they had a good time in Baja California. So cavalry may be the place to be if you're in the Army. So we already said we're not going to change the structure of the industry. We're not going to change the way pigs are moved. And so we need to improve time to detection. That's our only option. We're collecting lots of samples. The USDA is collecting lots of samples, but they're always too late. They're at the end of the animal's life. They're at the time when the animals are being put to use and consumption. We need to do a better job at on-farm specimen collection, and we need to look at alternate specimens. And I want to point out, I had a bet with one of the people in the audience that I would say nothing about oral fluids, and I'm showing you there is not a word here on oral fluids, although that would be an option. We also need to change our sampling approach. We have been basing our sampling on representative sampling. If we look at the spatial temporal sampling models, they're much more efficient. They're going to serve us much better. We need to continue exploring this way and applying them. And we need to take these FAD tests out of the federal labs and get them into the NALM labs. We have this tremendous NALM system. These are the guys, these NALM labs are the ones that have access, direct access to on-farm samples. They know how to receive them. Our producers know and vets know how to send them to these NALM labs. These labs have testing capacity, and they have, for the most part, rapid data capture and reporting capability. I've been at Iowa State since 1990 when everything was paper-based. When we were running those 5,000 to 10,000 ELISAs every day, it was completely paper-based. We still turned everything around. We never slowed down our turnaround time. But now everything is bar-coded. It's all captured electronically. It's ready for the web. Or in this case, it's ready to report to government animal health authorities when it comes to FADs. This is the way to get things done. We also need highly reproducible FAD screening and confirmatory tests. You can't forget that you have to have confirmatory tests. So I'm going to echo Paul Sundberg's recent talk from the side of National Pork Board. We really need a new state-federal industry partnership so that we are ready to respond in a fast fashion. So this just shows the distribution of the NALM network. Here, of course, is the labs in Ames and Plum Island. But you can see the distribution then of these NALM labs is really much more compatible with rapid turnaround, rapid detection. Alternate specimens. Here's one from Tim Carpenter. Simulation studies predicted that a large portion of a dairy herd could be infected before it would be diagnosed based on detection of lesions. It could be detected several days earlier if bulk milk FMD surveillance were used. I still didn't say oral fluids. This thing about test reproducibility is huge. We have done very little work on test reproducibility. This is an example of the lack of reproducibility. In this case, 8 different laboratories ran PCRs on oral fluids. They ran PCRs for influenza A virus. And you can see really lousy reproducibility. We need to do this work now. Once we're dealing with something, once we're dealing with an FAD, we don't want to have to be trying to solve these issues. Now's the time to do it. And so reproducibility is a significant issue that has to be addressed. So I just emphasize, we already have this network where samples collected on a farm, our people know how to send them to our VDLs who already know how to do the testing. All our AAVLD accredited laboratories have extreme QA/QC procedures in place. We know how to do electronic reporting, and we are in good shape for our routine diagnostic for endemic disease. What I'm proposing is that we start implementing these FAD tests in our NALM labs. These can be done under the auspice of USDA, but in this case we have continuous training for our people. We're ready to rock and roll when things happen, right? And we're also looking at test performance, so we can figure out how reproducible, repeatable tests actually are. The entire point of this thing is, again, this reduced time to detection. Unprecedented risks. The way the industry is constructed, it's an extremely efficient industry. It has evolved to be efficient, but it has left itself extremely vulnerable to the admission, to the entry of infectious diseases. Unprecedented opportunities in the sense that our diagnostic labs are better than ever. We have the ability, the capability of testing huge numbers of samples, and because it's electronic, reporting those results back to state and federal animal health authorities. So I like this guy. I like what he says. In God we trust, all others bring data. We need testing, but it needs to be good data, it needs to be good tests, and we need it to move really fast.